Hi, welcome to the first episode of the Paranormal Wishes podcast. We're a podcast where authors geek out about anything and everything the paranormal genre has to offer. And I just realized we didn't go over which order we're going to introduce ourselves, so why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm TJ Deschamps, and I am a paranormal women's fiction author and urban fantasy and fairy tale retellings.
And I'm Coral Alejandra Moore. I write fantasy and paranormal, and all my books are kissing books. And we're here to talk to you today about what is the paranormal genre. So we figured we would start out. It is a good question. So I did open up the dictionary definition of paranormal just so we would have something to work with. And it's really funny. It says, denoting events or phenomena such as telekinesis or clairvoyance that are beyond the scope of normal scientific understanding. So it's very specific.
Wow, that's highly specific and part of the genre of paranormal. When it comes to paranormal fiction in books, movies, and television, it's part. There are telekinetics and psychics.
Well, what do you think the definition is?
Well, I mean, it can be pretty broad, but usually when I think of paranormal, I think of psychics and witches and ghosts and vampires, and I kind of think of the monsters within it, but really it's anything that is out of the ordinary, out of the mundane. It's anything supernatural, really. For me, that's what paranormal means to me.
Yeah, I like the comparison to supernatural. I think that's really a good thing to anchor to. The other thing I like is, just magic and anything and everything that is magical or that can't be explained through scientific means.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've got a little bit of a definition going, let's talk a little bit about the expectations of the genre. So when you're reading or watching or listening to something paranormal, what does it feel like it has to have? Like, does it have to have X number of creatures? Does it have to be 30% magical? Is there any kind of barrier?
That's where we border magical realism versus paranormal. But yeah, with paranormal, I think that it affects the daily life of whatever the protagonist is. Either they are a paranormal creature or the paranormal world affects them, and it affects the plot and it affects their character development.
Yeah, it definitely has to be involved somehow. I mean, there's a whole kind of subgenre, I feel like, where the main character is just like a normal human. But even though they're a normal human, they still become involved in the paranormal world for whatever reason. And it has dragged them in so that they have to deal with it and they have to confront the creatures or the magic or whatever's going on.
Oh, those are the best because they're fish out of water stories. Like they
Right.
might be totally competent in the mundane world, but then they get in the supernatural world and they're like, oh, wow, everybody's more powerful than I am. And now I have to grow. And that's an excellent way of storytelling. Definitely. What would you say would not be paranormal?
So I think we have to I think regular old monster stories, kind of like the horror stories of like the 80s and 90s, I think those are maybe not paranormal as we're kind of describing it, because even though there's like paranormal creatures or supernatural creatures, the main character isn't necessarily involved in the supernatural stuff, right? Like sometimes it's just as simple as monster X is coming after me and I have to get away. And that doesn't really feel to me like a paranormal story. That's more like a horror story almost.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And then we'll definitely get into later about paranormal versus horror versus fantasy, because they do overlap. But yeah, that would be a good, like when it's meant to scare and not meant to grow. I think that would get out of the broader definition of it. Instead of being a tool, it's part of just a tool of another genre. Yes.
Right. Is there anything that you feel like doesn't belong?
For me, the paranormal genre, what doesn't belong, I think, and this would probably be controversial, but I think what doesn't belong in paranormal right now is something that's actively practiced. And I don't mean like shoot, because I do involve a religion in my books, but in mythology, but I think that something that is what doesn't belong in paranormal is any way vilifying a community. That's what doesn't belong in paranormal for me.
Yeah.
And or paranormal used as a moral device, like, oh well, like this is bad, so we want to stay away from this. We want to get into like the whole 80s, how D&D was vilified and things like that. I think that doesn't belong in paranormal. Paranormal is used to drive a point of something that is anti magic, and like a genre everybody likes. That's what I think doesn't belong.
That's really, really interesting to me. And I think it's important too, because sometimes in paranormal stories, we get into kind of a place of, preaching that certain, I don't know, beliefs are more important than other ones, or are better than other ones, or are preferable to other ones in whatever way. And that feels very, it feels like it belongs somewhere else. You're totally right. I don't know where, but
making
not
a monster out of anything that doesn't think like you do. Boom, like
yeah.
that
And
was definitely
I think paranormal actively twists that. In fact, it tries to make monsters and things that aren't like you and things that behave differently than you a little more approachable and a little more I'm going to say necessary, but like as part of the fabric of the world is what I mean.
Yeah. And I think that kind of gets us into the history of the genre. If we go back to it's earlier than this. I mean, paranormal has been along as long as humans have been telling ghost stories or, stories of mythology and magic. But like, if we go in the history of the genre, we go back to like Mary Shelley. Everybody says Frankenstein, Frankenstein as if that's the monster's name, but it was always the doctor who was the monster of her story, not the creation. And I liked that, that it was the humans, it wasn't the supernaturals.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that was brought forward too. I think a lot of the stories that are being told right now in the genre are very much, yes, there's monsters and monsters are scary, but the really scary things are the people and what people can do. And of course, if we're talking about Mary Shelley, kind of like the other person that belongs there is Bram Stoker, of course, and the Dracula story. And that's kind of the two Gothic era monster stories that probably started at least the literary convention of paranormal stuff. Like you were saying, we've been telling stories and mythologies and other things going back forever. But when it started to become sort of the literary appreciation of these things was with them, I think.
Yeah. And I think Bram Stoker, he was like the opposite end of Mary Shelley. He was more like
100%.
The monsters are bad and these virtues are good. And Bram Stoker is a can of worms to open of, wow, what not to do, what not to do when you're an author, like now, but his stuff had a place historically, but yeah, now a lot of people are opening like, oh, guess what he did there, and guess what he did there, and it's like, wow, like it's amazing. And like the Penny Dreadfuls, like that was another one. Some of the authors would be more like a Penny Dreadful was a periodical that would come out, be printed, cheap. They were only a penny. The masses could read them, and they were filled with stories of vampires, witches, all that, everything that's paranormal today. Like Penny Dreadfuls, we got a lot from that, from that, except for we are shifting on our head from the vilifying to turning it around to, okay, who's the real monsters here?
Yeah, especially with Stoker. I think there was a lot of moral preaching, it seemed like, especially where women were concerned. Women, if you were a little bit slutty, then it was your fault whatever happened to you. I always come back to, I can't remember what her name is, but Mina's friend who has like a relationship with Dracula. And you're like, well, she brought it on herself because she should have been chaste. And if she had been, none of this would have happened. And I'm just like, okay.
Pining away for somebody that went to another country for months and months and months and months, and then just stopped writing you. Just be her friend.
Yeah. You should wait. Just wait for your man to come home. He'll be back eventually or something. Very dated now when you look at a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
And as we kind of come forward a little bit in time, I know we had talked about like the 80s and 90s horror genres, where you and I both have a lot of love for those older movies. So tell me about where you think that fits in.
So when I was a kid, I mean, my inspiration as an author, when I was a kid, my parents watched a lot of B horror movies with like vampires, and I always wondered, why are the ladies running from this dude? He's just going to make them immortal like the rest of these people here. Don't run, just go. Just go with it.
Seems like a good deal.
This is a good deal. What's wrong with you? And like, I mean, and then there was, the zombie movies that would come out back then. And I watched a lot that I really shouldn't have. And we've had conversations about that before, about being children of the 80s.
Yeah. 80s kids watched and read a lot of things we shouldn't have, probably.
Oh, yes. Stephen King.
Very questionable stuff.
Pet Cemetery, and all those other, just stuff that, but yeah.
And so much so, in fact, our conversations that we spawned off a whole nother episode where we're going to talk just about like the TV shows and movies and how that fits into the genre, because we started talking about it and our list grew so long. We were like, that's an entire other episode. So you have that to look forward to. I think next time we'll come back and talk about that stuff separately and in a lot more detail. But yeah, I think you're right. I think especially people who are around our age kind of grew up with a lot of that horror, and that kind of underpins what the paranormal genre is now. I think we also both talked about reading a lot of horror when we were, in the like 12 to 15 age. We both read a lot of Stephen King, and, he's always shelved in horror, but, that's paranormal too. Like his worlds are very heavily magical and very heavily supernatural. And I feel like he's mislabeled as horror, or maybe, paranormal just butts up against horror like really, really closely.
Oh, it does. I mean, yeah, because these are these are the stories that were meant to scare us, like before King, and, he meant to scare us too. But like, I feel paranormal gives us a safe place to explore the things that scare us, or put them in a fun place, like there's a lot of authors doing that, and we could go into that, and we will go into that in future episodes about monsters and, where they have a place, historically versus where we're putting them today in society. And we touched on it a little, but like, there's some really fun stuff going on in the paranormal genre right now with that particular trope.
Yeah, I agree. And I think maybe that's where the line is. I think you're right on, where horror is like, these are monsters and they're really scary. And then paranormal is like, but it's kind of hot too, right? And it's kind of fun and kind of exciting. And there's another side to it that's not, these things are all evil. Instead, just like people, there's good monsters and bad monsters, and it's all up to the individual rather than, X monster is bad. And
the nuance today is wonderful. The nuance of it, from going from sexy to, well, he's just like me. He just, he just has a third arm, or is, sometimes turns into a bat, that's definitely.
He has horns. So what? I bet that's a real pain when you try to brush your hair.
Yeah. I like that I like that today what we're doing to subvert the old tropes. Yes, it's definitely pretty awesome.
And I wonder if that's kind of part of the definition of what paranormal is too, that it kind of takes the things that scare us and subverts them into something else. You know, sometimes they're still scary. There's always bad guys in paranormal stories too. You know, there's bad vampires or, you know, bad wizards or bad whatever. But they're not bad because they're a wizard. They're bad because they're bad.
It's more of an action rather than how what category of paranormal that they fell under. Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's a good kind of place to slide into our next topic, which is sort of like the paranormal genre versus the lore that kind of underpins it. And we've talked about this a little bit previously. The things that came before that have turned into the paranormal genre or that contribute to the paranormal genre. What's your favorite of the lore things?
Okay, so I mean, I love a good ghost story, and I love mythology. I mean, mythology is one of the things I have studied, and so, but ghost stories are just a hobby of mine, and I love them. And I think recently I heard about the White Witch of Jamaica. And I can't get into the details of this too much because I do not have the information in front of me, but I know that it is an actual historical woman who was a serial killer. She was born in the Caribbean, and she ended up being orphaned very young, raised by a practitioner of witchcraft, and she kind of took it in and took some of the darker elements of it, and she decided that she wanted to just off her husbands. She got married. She offed her first husband. She ended up with his plantation. She was terrible to his slaves, and she ended up killed by her own lover, who was also her accomplice in many of her murders. So she is supposed to haunt the mansion that she lived in. And I feel like her story is one of those, like karma kind of paid her back. You know, she was a terrible person in life and ended up, being and terrible to her lovers. And it was her own lover that ended up killing her. And I feel like that is one of those, moralistic in a good way things of, hey, you're terrible to all these people. It will come back onto you. And I like that story. Yeah. And then there's, I don't know the whole thing about Lady Bathory, but vampires, a lot of the vampire lore comes from her, and witches eating children, because she was a noblewoman in Europe who she had a lot of the virgins under her lady, like her lands that were supposed to be under her protection. She had them killed and she bathed in their blood. And so the Lady of Bathory was known for that. So those were some of my they're terrible, horrible stories, but I'm just fascinated by them because what makes a person turn into what would be a horror story, that fascinates me. And I think that the paranormal genre is influenced by these real life monsters.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of the stories that we tell in the paranormal genre are not the same kind of moralistic stories, I don't think. But they are moralistic stories also. And I think we like to take those because it's interesting to see how human nature kind of reacts to different situations, right? So like if you're in that, Jamaica story, what do you do? Are you the lover who kills her because you need to stop her? I guess in that case, he probably didn't care so much about what she was doing, but maybe she was a bitch to him or something. I don't know.
She cursed his son or something. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So he was like, oh yeah, no, now you're done. Yeah.
But yeah, I think a lot of the stories that we tell in the genre are like that. You put people in very fraught situations, and it's intensified because there's magic and because there's the spiritual and because there's all this stuff going on, and it makes it even more charged and more extreme than it would have been.
Yeah.
And we touched on mythology, we touched on mythology a little bit kind of at the beginning of that. I think you and I both love a mythology story, and
Yes.
stories based in mythology. You do a lot of Greek stuff with yours. I like Norse. I don't know why. I've just always loved it.
One series is Celtic and one series is Greek, but I definitely throw in the kitchen sink in there just because I'm like, everything's real. Yes,
yeah, and I think that's the fun thing too. I mean, I really feel like when stories kind of say, oh, there's this one mythology is true, but none of the rest of them are true, it kind of ignores the fact that our world is a big and complicated place. Like, there's all kinds of things in the world, not just, whatever your favorite mythology is.
Yeah.
There's so much that you can take and adapt and make better, I think.
Oh, definitely. Like just like the legends of vampires and zombies. There's so many cultures around the world. I mean, a lot gets, because of Bram Stoker, a lot gets attributed to Eastern Europe. But if you look, there's vampire stories or undead stories around the world, and really rich histories of storytelling, and it's within different cultures. And zombies, another thing that's that is around the world. I mean, witches definitely are are also out of many cultures. So
like, there's shapeshifters in Asia, there's shapeshifters in Africa, in Europe, in South America, in North America. Like, there are shapeshifters everywhere. They're all slightly different, but yeah, they're very present in a lot of the lore going back.
The monsters, what is considered a demon or an angel, different cultures, I mean, have different takes. Like, a lot of cultures, like the Kitsune are like, they have, there's like 3 or 4 different names for those. And, my brain is leaving me, but I think it's a 9-tailed fox. Sometimes she's kind of like a succubus. Sometimes she's, good luck. And so it depends on the region of where you're at and what the meaning of those monsters are. Like the Fae in Ireland. Everybody loves like Fae and fairy porn right now, but I'm like, when I think of the Fae, and even I make jokes and have Fae in my books, but like I'm like, when I think of them, I think of gods, and I think of wrathful ones, or ones that you got to appease or your life isn't going to go well. And I feel them closer to nature. And I think a lot of that, when it comes to mythology and our it kind of goes back almost to like an animism thing, like dryads associated with trees. So you kind of like, nature is a hard thing to control. So if you can deify that or make it into or personify that into a being, you get a better understanding of it, because you can relate better to something that has like almost human-ish qualities about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I can't believe we forgot the Fae when we were first talking about the things, but you're absolutely right. I feel like the Fae are very much, to me, that sort of deification of nature, because nature can be cruel and nature doesn't really care about you. Nature just does its own thing. And that is, for me, very much what the Fae are all about. They're kind of inscrutable. Yeah, we can take things from it, and it is what keeps us alive, literally, but also it can kill you in a second without even really acknowledging anything about you, which has always seemed like a very Fae thing to me, where they're just like capricious, and they don't care about your rules or whatever you think is right. They just do whatever they feel.
I mean, yeah, like nature, like it's not good or bad. It's just what it is. And
Mhm.
I think we get that more with ancient cultures and religion, is that there's not a good or bad. It's just things that exist, and we have to learn how to coexist with it and its moods. Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely I agree with you about the fae and like nature, definitely.
And I think that kind of dovetails a little bit with, kind of what we were talking about with angels and demons too, because angels and demons are obviously like a very religious thing, but not just our current day religions. Like a lot of people think that, it just has to do with Christianity and whatever, but like it goes back. Those concepts go back before those names were even used for those things. There were always like demonic figures that did evil just because they wanted to do evil, and then there were protectors who protected humans for whatever reasons, maybe benevolent reasons, or maybe just because they felt like it. And we use the words like angels and demons now, but there have been so many different names for all of those things over the years, and they've just kind of come forward with us into where we are now.
Yeah. Something more powerful than us as a protector or a punisher. It just takes us to childhood, where our parents were, like almost godlike with their power of, deeming if you've done a good job or done a bad job. And I think that translated into story as powerful figures like that, like just going back to, like childhood and just having something greater than you to depend on, it helps a lot of people cope. Or
It's really true.
keeps people that might be doing some things they shouldn't be, like, oh, I really don't want this demon to come and get me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important too. That it was used as kind of a, well, you shouldn't do bad, or else you're going to end up, wherever
Like
you're going to end up, and you're not going to like it.
the Baba Yaga or the boogeyman. It's just like, yeah, if you don't do this thing or that thing, like this. Or, hey, give me your tooth. This fairy will come and get it. Nobody thought that was creepy in childhood. Or
I'm pretty sure I always thought it was creepy, at least a little. I'm like, why does this fairy even want my tooth? It's kind of gross.
I used to watch this show called Teen Titans Go. It's a DC show or whatever, but like they had an episode with the tooth fairy. He was just like eating the teeth, and I was just like, "That's why he wants that." There's been many takes on the tooth fairy and like Jack Frost, nature, spirit or whatever, but yeah, that one just creeped me out. Well, an elf once a year climbing into down your chimney and giving gifts, that's cool. We'll feed him to make sure that he doesn't take the children along with him, but here you go. Yeah.
Well, there's always a price. You want presents, you got to give up the kids or the cookies, whatever.
We like to think we're modern, but we're taking very old pagan traditions and just like, here, let's put this elf on the shelf to watch you. So we still have that in our culture today. We have, those angels and demons of, modern world.
Yeah, a lot of that has come forward through the years, and people don't even really think about it. We just think about, oh, well, there's Santa Claus and an elf on a shelf, and that's all very modern. And I love the people who are like, it's all very consumer, and I'm like, is it though? I mean,
we've been doing this a long time. We used to make the thing, like the little figure.
Like that story goes back a long way in a lot of different forms. We're not as clever as we think we are.
A watcher of some sort, yeah.
Or a judger. He gets to judge if you're naughty or nice, and based on that, will either give you a punishment or a reward. Like that's an old story.
Yeah,
especially to motivate children. Like that's how you make children behave. You have to dangle a reward or a punishment or something, and that's how it works. We've been touching on this a little bit, kind of where paranormal and fantasy and horror all kind of butt up against each other. How much of what we consider paranormal would you say is could be shelved under fantasy or could be shelved under horror just as easily?
I think it's the intention on which you use the paranormal elements, like we were talking earlier. I think with fantasy, it's usually in a world that is not our own. There is contemporary and urban fantasy where the world's a butt or mix, but sometimes there's always that veil that keeps keeps one from the other. I think what defines paranormal as a genre in the whole Venn diagram of paranormal and fantasy and horror, what separates it out is intention of the story. What is this story trying to do? Like Supernatural was for pure entertainment. There wasn't really a moral story there. That was pure entertainment. And it went on for many, many, many years. And some people will call it horror, but I'm like, that story was not to scare people. There were scary elements, but I feel it was more paranormal than horror because the focus was on the relationship between the brothers and their found family. And, of course, the dad relationship was part of it too. But it was really about Sam and Dean. If we want to get into, pop culture references, it was really about Sam and Dean. Whereas horror is about escaping the monsters or getting caught by the monsters. I watched, how will the monster change who you are when you have to be chased by one? I mean, that is mine. Fantasy, you're just in another world, and you're dealing with the monsters and demons, and it's not this world. And it's almost, fantasy for me feels like a complete escape, just different circumstances, but it's still examining our world just through a different lens.
I think for me, I think you're totally right. But kind of circling back a little bit to what I said earlier about what doesn't belong in paranormal, I feel like the monster stories that are to scare you, and there's no moral gray area. When the monsters are just evil, they're coming to kill you because they feel like killing you. Those are the ones that belong in horror. They don't even have to have a reason. They want to end you for whatever reason that is, and you have to try to escape, like you were saying. You have to try to beat them somehow, or kill them, or do something. And those feel pretty clearly like as belonging to horror for me. I think the line between fantasy, and you were kind of going there a little bit in your answer, it's much harder because sure, there are things that are obviously fantasy, like, they take place in a different world, a world that's not this one. And so those are obviously fantasy, but then there are also fantasy stories that are told in this world that may or may not be considered paranormal. And I think this is a little bit where that magical realism line comes into play. So is it that the real world is just magical inherently, or is there something that happened to the world to make it magical? I feel like that might be where the line is if I had to pick a line. I don't know.
And how would you define it then? Would you define it as the world is magical or something has happened to the world? How would you take that? Because it's really hard to disentangle paranormal from these other two genres. They're all sisters, and they all are categorized in the BISAC or whatever they call it, BISAC, and I forget what that stands for, categories. They're all under fantasy, paranormal, urban fantasy, regular family, epic, the subgenres go on forever, and they'll probably keep on going and subdividing within it. Like the RPG, another one. So how would you just if you could pretty much section it off, but what does it mean in that Venn diagram? What do you think?
So actually, when you were saying lit RPG, I was like, oh yeah, right. So lit RPG also kind of takes place in our present day, but sort of it's like a portal fantasy, right? So it's in our present world, but you're transported to another world where magic or whatever is real. But it's like a part of this world. It's like a sub, I don't know, a subdomain or something of this world. And so, yeah, that's really, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, right. That's a whole other can of worms that I hadn't even really thought of, because lit RPG definitely belongs in fantasy, but it's not urban fantasy, because that's kind of, urban fantasy is more like there's magic in our current world, and lit RPG is more like, but there's another world where there's magic that's like butting up against ours. And so, yeah, that line is really even fuzzier than I thought it was. Like, I always knew it was fuzzy, but it's really fuzzy.
In my head, no, this is fantasy and this is paranormal. I was like, well, it's going to be so easy. Sword and sorcery is fantasy, and witches and vampires are paranormal, but they're because humans have incredible imaginations. A lot of it's getting married right now. I mean, and even before in the past, I mean, it's cyclic, like it'll all get delineated and then come back together, and
yeah,
separate.
Well,
again.
I mean, like, so even if you're taking just like Tolkien, right? Like, the elves in Tolkien are obviously based on the Fae, but they're very different, and they're the same in a lot of aspects. And so, like, even when you go back to what a lot of people would call like foundational texts or whatever in fantasy, like, he's borrowing from other things too. He has taken these other.
There was paranormal.
Yes. So it's very interesting to try to like cut that line, I think, because I think really they do belong together in a lot of places. I think you're right. Sword and sorcery is kind of its own thing. And like epic fantasy is kind of its own thing. And paranormal is pretty easy to pull apart from that, for sure. But then
I feel like paranormal has been more inclusive for a longer time than fantasy has. I mean, I get myself in trouble with everything I say in this first episode. But no, I mean,
well, no, I agree with you, because there's a lot of rules to what is a fantasy or not. And like, when I write like secondary world fantasies, I always run up against those things, because like, I don't want to have it have elves, and I don't want to have it have whatever, because that to me feels too much like this world, even though Tolkien's world is specifically not our world. But to me, anytime you start bringing that stuff in, you're pulling aspects of our world into that world.
What has been represented has been predominantly from one culture. I think with paranormal, I saw more characters representing our actual world in paranormal than in fantasy, because fantasy, they'll have a dragon, but they don't want it to not be Northern European looking people in there. And it's like not Northern. And so it's like, okay, if you can have a dragon, anything goes, anything goes. And I think that more authors are turning that way with fantasy, but I think paranormal first was more inclusive of, like other peoples and other cultures. Sometimes not in a healthy way, but it started.
I feel like that has to do with a lot of and we're gonna tiptoe past this, because we actually do have another episode we want to do that's all about
where we're going to talk about it. Yes.
But I feel like that has to do with pushback from fans. Like the new Lord of the Rings show. I can't even remember what the name of it was, but like, there was so much pushback because they were like black elves, and everybody was like, "Well, elves can't be black." And
oh gosh, everybody. With the little
what are you doing?
Her alone. She is precious.
You can have dragons, but you can't have black people for whatever reason, but whatever arbitrary reason you would like to invent.
I have to retract. I just said Halle Berry, and that's not her name. Halle.
Well, while you're looking that up, I will say I feel like the reason that epic fantasy and that kind of fantasy has not been inclusive is that reason, because it was so
close to Halle Bailey. Yes,
Bailey, not
that
Barry.
girl.
Yeah, you're right.
She's wonderful.
So I feel like the reasoning is because that was so firmly based in like European myths. And because of that, people were like, oh, well, you can't have, XYZ there because this was supposed to take place in Europe. And first of all, anybody who actually believes there were no people of color in medieval Europe are just wrong. But aside from that, I feel like that was authors, first of all, being influenced by what had come before them because nobody had written people of color into fantasy in those areas. And also that they didn't want to have to run up against that difficulty. And so when you write something in the modern world, it's much easier to be like, okay, there's Asian people because, hey, there's Asian people here now, and so I like that better. I definitely feel more comfortable when worlds are a little more inclusive. And especially the older I get, I think I always view casts that are predominantly white and don't have anyone else in there with a little bit of suspicion, just because I'm like, you weren't even trying. You didn't even try.
Shonda Rhimes just took like historical fiction and she said, no, we're just going to do what we're going to do in this show with, like the Bridgerton and all that. And I love it because and those shows are so well written, beautifully shot, not paranormal, but like it's fantasy in a sense. If you're taking to another time and a place and you're making it the way that you want it to be, it's a type of fantasy and it's, that's awesome. But yes,
they should do that with the Gail Carriger books because then it would be paranormal and it would be amazing.
Yes. Shonda, find Gail Carriger.
Yeah. Shonda, if you're watching, which you're not, go talk to Gail Carriger.
I'm talking like I know her. I don't.
Shonda, baby, please. Because as soon as you said that, I was like, oh yeah, we could have historical and with magic. That would be great.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
And I feel like that's a really good segue actually to another point that we wanted to talk about, which was kind of like what were our gateways into the genre? What were the things
the modern
that you
genre
read
paranormal
that pulled you into paranormal? Why do you love it? What started your love?
So in high school, I was a weirdo who read a lot of classical literature, not assigned. And I like the feel of that, but I also love those. Remember, we were talking earlier about those B vampire movies. And I got my hands on Interview with a Vampire. I had this goth friend and she was like, here, you need to read this. And I was 16 years old. And as a queer, I was like, oh, I see how this is coded. And maybe she didn't mean to, but I was like, thank you. Because there was many elements in those books. And I know now Anne Rice, you surface.
She was doing her best.
She's doing her best, but we have things going on with that, especially Mayfair Witches. I love those books, but yes, incest, things like that. Yeah, anyways, without getting, but one of my earliest paranormal influences, and that was not horror, that was paranormal, and it also had went back in time and to the future. That the whole series was really great. The Vampire Chronicles and Laurel K. Hamilton. Someone said, I was reading Jacqueline Carey. She's fantasy, but my ex went into Barnes and Nobles and said, hey, this person is having a book hangover before there was a book hangover. How can you help her? And they're like, oh, if they like Jacqueline Carey, they're going to love Laurel K. Hamilton. And I did. I really did. And so
I feel like that's a questionable recommendation. I mean, I'm glad you liked it, but to me, those feel wildly different things.
Oh yeah. I think I liked her books, but we got in our conversation on that. And up to a point. And then I felt that they went in a direction that, and I understand because she's been very vocal why she went in that direction. When people were telling her don't have sex in books, she was like, I'm going to put more in there. And
what was that? More sex? Okay.
And I think that I liked it as an introduction. And then I started to devour everything I possibly could within the genre of urban fantasy and paranormal books. I just started devouring it, and I haven't looked back. I just love it so much. I'm like, well, I could read broadly again, but why bother?
Why?
Other than my research, which is a lot of history, and mythology textbooks, and also fun stuff. Like I buy Monster Guides still. I'm 48 years old this month, and I still buy Monster Guides because the art's gorgeous, and yeah, it's always little fun tidbits in them.
I didn't come to Jacqueline Carey until much, much later. And she does have an urban fantasy series. It is not very much like her Kushel series, unfortunately. At least I don't think so. But I feel like Kushel's is very much right on the edge of paranormal. And I think the reason we don't put it there has to do with it being historical rather than being in another world. At least that's what I feel personally about
fantasy. We all know it's France.
Right.
We all know it's France. Another country was Germany or something. I can't remember, but yeah, we all know.
Yeah.
We all know what it was. We all know it was Europe, but yeah, yeah.
But I feel like it's very paranormal-y. Like it's very, it very much belongs with paranormal. I feel like. So I came to her much later. My first forays into paranormal, we mentioned it before. I started reading like Stephen King. I read a lot of horror when I was a teenager into college. I actually didn't read for pleasure very much in college. I was too busy reading like college stuff. So I kind of fell away from reading for a while. But when I was done with that, I came back, and some of the first books that I picked up after I came back were Shannon McGuire. Her October Day series was probably, I think, the first paranormal I read. And I was like, what is this? It's in the modern world, but there's magic and there's fae and there's ghosts, and this is amazing. And so that was kind of my gateway into the genre. And it's interesting because I am notoriously not a finisher of things. So like when there's a super, super long series, I make it to about 4 and I fall off after that. I'm not a completionist, drives my husband crazy. Like when we're playing video games or whatever, I stop halfway and I'm like, I'm good. I don't need any more. But that is like an example of a series that has gone on for years and years and years and is still going on. Yes. I only ever read, I think, 4 or 5 of them. And I was like, no, we're good here. And I have done that through all of my paranormal hijinks, basically. From there, I went to like Patricia Briggs. She has like a whole bunch of werewolf books. I've only ever read like a handful of those. And I think what happened was, when I was reading them, only like 4 or 5 of them had come out. So I stopped when I was done and I just never picked them up again. I went on to other things. And, maybe someday I'll come back to some of those series and finish them up. But I almost feel like the genre has just gotten better as the years have gone on. And I don't feel the need to go back to those anymore because I feel like they're, I don't want to say dated like in a bad way, but we've come a long way, baby. We don't need to be there anymore.
Yeah, who I read now, I mean, is definitely different than who I read even 10 years ago. Like what I read now, these were the people, like when I said I was reading Anne Rice, that was in 91, like 1991. So it's been a bit like 30 something years, so yeah. And and it's funny. There's a lot more asked of us now, even though some authors aren't doing it. There's a lot more asked of us to do, work and be more inclusive and to represent the world better if we're going to represent it. And at the same time, not tell experiences that aren't our own. And so, definitely what I read now is different. I don't finish everything. I feel bad about that. I used to, but there's a few series that I have read every single book and I'll read it over and over again. And it's paranormal. It's listed as urban fantasy, but the Kate Daniels series by Ilona Andrews, I will read that series over and over and over again because even though there is violence and all kinds of things that go on in those books. I'm telling you that it's my comfort read. I just like that Kate collects the monsters and the killers and she makes them her family. Like, I don't know why, but I love them. And, like they're writing a few spin-off series, and I'm one of those super fans that like will read everything. I have my own publishing schedule, so I don't get to read them as avidly as before I was an author, but I used to read like whatever they threw up on their website as it came out. But but I am exactly the same about series. I will get to book 5 on you, but by book 10, if we're not together anymore, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was struggling to think if there was actually a series that I had ever finished. And I don't think so, unless it was like a trilogy or something. Like, then of course I can finish it. But like, even going back to my fantasy reading before I got into paranormal, like, the only one is Wheel of Time, and there are very specific reasons why I finished that one, and I felt like I had to. We're not going to get into it, but like, that is the only one. Otherwise, what was that?
I've never read it. I know.
Oh, I mean, 100% don't. 100% don't. I do not recommend it to anyone. But I was reading it as it came out in high school, and it was very sort of foundational for me as the writer I became, I think. And my brother and I were reading it together, and so it was a thing that we did together, and that's the reason that I finished it. But I don't recommend it. And the show is really good, though, so you should watch the show. Don't read the books. That's my hot take on Wheel of Time. Unless you had already started reading it, then maybe you want to finish it, but you should never pick up the first.
Did Sanderson take over that series, or was it another?
Yes. After Robert Jordan died, he wrote the last 3 or 4 books. I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 now. But yeah, Brandon Sanderson finished up that series afterwards. But that's the only one I have ever finished in my life. I just don't finish things. I am a consummate not finisher of media. There was even one game that I was playing with my husband called Persona 5, and he's like, "You're like 20 minutes from the end. Are you ever going to finish it?" And I was like, "Nah." I don't need to.
The story goes on.
That's what I do. And I realized that not too long ago, because someone actually questioned me on that. They're like, "Why don't you want to finish things?" And I was like, because it doesn't end if I don't finish it. It just keeps going into the future.
I'm hanging out with everybody in my
right. Like, I don't like endings. Maybe that's what it is. And so I like it when things just continue. If I don't reach the end, then it just continues. And I can, write my own headcanon. And I have a lot of headcanon of a lot of different things. And it's a beautiful place. My head is a beautiful place.
I think with me, the reason why I can't finish is if things get formulaic and you know where the next thing is going to happen because it's happened in 5 other books. Or when people are happily settled and everything's good. Oh no, we're going to make this bad. I'm like, oh, no, that happens in real life. And
I hate that bait and switch. The last book was a happily ever after, except now it's not, because we need to write another book.
Someone from their past has come into this, and they want to
or
not
someone
only
dies,
her husband, but her throne. It's like, what?
Yeah.
No, that is no. But we totally do need that in fiction, just not for me as a reader.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing too. Not everything is for everybody. Like, there are plenty of things that are not for me, and that's fine. Like, people can go on enjoying them forever. I don't care. It doesn't bother me at all. So I think we're coming up on the hour mark. So I think we're going to call an end to this first episode.
Wow. That was fast.
Yeah, it was fast. I looked down at the clock. I was like, wow, we only got like 4 minutes left.
My brain said, we don't have enough to talk about. We're just going to not make it.
I knew that wasn't going to happen. Both of us can talk forever. So our next episode is going to be the one that we had talked about a little bit during this one. That's going to be about other media. We kind of just pushed it off into its own thing because we realized we could go on like a whole other series of rants just about like TV shows that we watched when we were teenagers and all those things. So that's what's coming up next. And we've got a few other really cool episodes planned. We've got one that's all about monsters. We've got one that's all about tropes. So there's going to be some really, really cool episodes coming up.
I have feelings.
I have feelings about so many things. And we're going to have some cool guests that we're lining up right now to come along with us and talk with us. As soon as we have details about that stuff, we will let you know in all the places that we are. Oh, I guess we should say we have a Facebook page that is Paranormal Wishes. We also have an Instagram and a TikTok. Yes, we have a TikTok. So we will be in all of those places, and you can join us there. We will link to them in the note things that I have yet to figure out, but I'm definitely going to figure them out. And you can follow us there and keep track of our hijinks whenever we have hijinks to have. Tammy, is there anything you would like to say as we wrap up?
Not a lot. We do have a we do have a website coming, and for our TikTok, we are going to be making some fun little promotional skits and things, so please follow us there. It's going to be fun, and there'll be clips from this, and you can actually see what we look like and how we facial react to what we're saying. And we've really worked on our lighting, so please watch.
We really worked on our lighting. I hope it's great. We spent like 20 minutes talking about lighting before we even started. Now they're all going to be like, wow, okay, it's still there.
And then they go and watch it and they're like, well,
please come into the comments and tell us how to make our lights better. That would be amazing. All right. And without further ado, we are going to say goodbye, and we will talk to you next time.
All right.
Go ahead. Wave.
Wait.